Okay. So, as most of you know, at the Bear Orientation, that 2018 marks Katmai's 100th anniversary as a unit of the National Park System. President Woodrow Wilson originally created Katmai National Monument to protect the area in and around the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. Since then, Katmai has been expanded and became a national park and preserve. During the centennial year, we invite you to join us as we celebrate Katmai National Park and Preserve by hosting a number of events focused on different themes that together tell important chapters of Katmai's story. Along the way, we will highlight its remarkable geology, tell stories of its human inhabitants from both the past and present, and marvel at its beauty and wonder about its thriving and abundant wildlife. Katmai's geology is remarkable and offers diverse landscape composed of expansive mountains, active volcanoes and glaciers, a wild and beautiful seacoast, and abundant freshwater lakes and rivers. The catastrophic eruption of Nova Abrupta in 1912 took place long ago when compared to a human lifespan, but geologically is recent. Even today, life continues to recover from the effects of the eruption. Human habitation of the Katmai region goes back many thousands of years, and the resulting history speaks of thriving communities as well as their perseverance through periodic times of difficulty. This story continues as Alaska Natives maintain their traditional lifeways in the momentum of the ever-changing world. Their connection to this region is profound and worthy of their unwavering support and respect. It is through the efforts of many dedicated individuals from diverse walks of life over the years and up to the present that has ensured that wildlife remains abundant and diverse across the region. Today, Katmai National Park and Preserve continues to support world-class fisheries and wildlife viewing opportunities. To be able to observe the Alaskan brown bear in its natural environment is a testament to the priorities of our nation and a gift to humankind today. Our task is to carry this legacy on into the future as Katmai National Park and Preserve enters its second century. Today we've gathered together friends of Katmai, a place where each of us carries a special connection so that we might have the privilege to hear from subject matter experts who themselves have spent a considerable amount of their time and talents striving to better understand this wonderful place. We are grateful for their willingness to share their knowledge and with us to take a moment to celebrate Katmai National Park and Preserve's 100th anniversary. And I would like to introduce Katie Ringsmuth, and you're a historian, and you probably could tell more about yourself. And yeah, so I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Karen.
You're welcome.
All right, how are you guys? There, how's that? You good?
You're great.
Okay, so I feel like it's an absolute privilege to be here, and this couldn't be a more wonderful opportunity than to help share the centennial, the 100-year anniversary of Katmai National Monument, which it actually started at, right? So my name is Katie Ringsmuth. I teach history at the University of Alaska Anchorage. However, it all started here in this room for me. I was a park ranger way back in 1997, and I was here for 3-4 years. I can't remember how many. That's how old I am. And then I actually, because of the work that I was doing, is I knew nothing, quite frankly, and was able to come here and interact with people, which I found just wonderful to be able to talk with people from all over the world, to share their experiences. It wasn't just me talking at them. It was this wonderful, interactive, engaging experience, and I found that was my pathway. So I have had the privilege to be able to lecture in classrooms, and quite frankly, I don't lecture. When I'm in my classes, I still employ the same kind of ideas and principles that I gained here at the National Park Service. I even call them presentations for my students, that I'm here to share this information with them, and it always has become this remarkably wonderful experience, and I always find it is a terrific two-way street. So this has been a great opportunity. I spent 10 years working for the National Park Service as a cultural resource historian, and I spent many years writing histories here for the Park Service. I actually wrote a book about clam canneries, so it was like as low on the food trade as you could get, right? It wasn't even fish, but that was a really fun. And in fact, what I'm going to talk about tonight is It actually might be kind of boring and dry, and I hope I don't put a lot of people to sleep. It's kind of it's pretty academic, but it is part of the fisheries history out here. And what we do in the National Park Service, besides being able to offer these wonderful experiences with the natural world, the bears and the fish and all of these, it's also to manage the history, the cultural history. And it's a very important part of the National Park Service's priority and role. Congress assigns the National Park Service the stewardship of the National Register, right? So when you see a building on the National Register, it doesn't have to be in a national park, right? It can be any place. It is our job to manage your history, right? And to assign it and to create an index and to say this is why it matters, because sometimes it goes away. But we can go in and get that history so it's not lost forever. So there are certain properties out here that are associated with fisheries management, and how that fishery out there in Bristol Bay became one of the greatest fisheries on the planet. And a lot of the science that took place right here. And so so it kind of the what I'm talking about is a bunch of buildings that you might look at, you're like, what the heck? Why is that historic? But together they tell this important story. And again, it's all about that fishery out there and how that is a model of resource management worldwide. So we're going to go ahead and talk about that tonight. All right, so located in the heart of Katmai National Park and Preserve is the Naknek Lake watershed. It's an interconnected lake system and streams that constitute the spawning grounds for the sockeye salmon migrating up the Naknek River. So how many of you guys saw all those fish today? Where do you think those fish come from? Yeah, they were out there in the Pacific Ocean, right? And they have to pass through right now a lot of nets out there, the gill nets, right, out there in Bristol Bay. And the Fish and Game, what they're doing is managing those fish. So what you're seeing up there is the escapement, what the fishermen are not catching right now, right? So this is part of a managed fishery. And I think that's important for us all to recognize when we're out there and seeing this incredible, we're part of this. Human beings are part of this place, right? This idea of wilderness and civilization, those are just constructs and words we create. We're a part of this, therefore we have to take responsibility. And what Brooks Camp does extraordinarily well is show us how we get it right. In a world where we're constantly seeing how we don't, this is a great place to see how we get it right. So going back about 9,000 years, right at the end of the Pleistocene, this was all one big lake, right? The glaciers retreated and left this big old lake. And as the glaciers began to melt and the Naknek River formed, right? Here's our good old Naknek River. The lake's water receded, and in fact, some of our oldest cultural sites are up there on Dumpling Mountain, right? And they predate even the fish themselves. So people and fish and bears even all kind of show up at the same time. And they're all a part of the recolonization of the Ice Age world, coming out of the Ice Age. So the Naknek River today is one of 5 major rivers that make up the world's largest commercial salmon fishery, known as Bristol Bay. How many, just give me a hands up, how many Alaskans are in here today? All right, yay, Alaska. All right. And how many people are from the United States? Somewhere locally? And how many people are from the big wide world beyond? Yeah. All right. Welcome, guys. Well, believe it or not, this is a story that connects us, right, to that larger world, thanks to these fish. Now, a significant part of Katmai's history throughout the 20th century is linked to industry. Commercialization, the industrialization of the salmon canneries located at the mouth of the Naknek River, and a lot of the activities that went on here had to do with these guys. The industrialization of the salmon located at the mouth of the Naknek River. So when you flew in, you might have seen a lot of fishermen getting ready. This is their peak right now. This is where they're catching as much fish as they possibly can. And if you're worried about this river being, if they're catching too much, well, this is still a sustainable fishery. And they just caught more fish on record, at least in probably to one of the top 5 seasons since they've been recording. So again, this is where we actually have done things right. So oftentimes the fisheries narrative has been at odds with each other, right? So when you think of all of the things that people do, the fisheries, what the mission is, for example, the park mission is to protect these guys, the fish resource for future generations, not to mention these guys right here, which you've been seeing, these furry fishermen. Now, for others, such as the indigenous fishers who fled Katmai, the people here after the volcano erupted in 1912, well, salmon meant life. They depended on the fish resource for their primary means of subsistence. While the commercial fishing industry's mission is to catch and to can as much fish as possible. And actually tomorrow I'm going to talk, if you're still in town, I'm going to talk a little bit more about these 3 missions and these 3 fishers and how they all connect. And the idea is, are these fishers actually in opposition? Do they share an opposite history, or is it in fact an overlapping history? And one of the projects I'm going to talk about tomorrow is how these stories actually do in fact overlap. It's easy to see on the surface, the tensions, but the more complex we get, the more history we understand and appreciate, the more in fact we are connected. And in fact, history is the common ground. It brings us together rather than divides us. And that's a lesson, heck, we can all take away. So the fisheries story, what I'm going to talk about tonight is a 4th narrative. The unsung hero, if you will, of this fish story, the scientist, and who's often overshadowed by all those catchers out there, right? The catching part of the story. And what's not widely known is that nearly half a century of counting fish on the Brooks Lake, not to mention a whole spectrum of fisheries science implemented on this river, contributed to making Bristol Bay one of the nation's greatest commercial salmon fisheries and a model for fisheries management worldwide. So by the last decade of the 19th century, industrialization in Bristol Bay caught the attention of the federal government. Well, why? Well, for one, what was happening here in Bristol Bay was consistent with resource extraction occurring throughout the American West. The mindset? Well, the sheer grandness of Alaska's rivers and fish led all of these commercial canners to believe that the territory's resources were inexhaustible. And of course, they didn't understand the biological migration of salmon. And the canners ended up lining fish traps across entire rivers before 1889, when the practice was banned. Of course, traps themselves were not banned, and those Alaskans in the room understand this history, but across entire rivers, that actually was banned. And what they found out, of course, is the resource is not inexhaustible. The fish runs collapsed and reduced annual catches and, of course, cannery profits, which is what they wanted. But with all of these canners rushing to Alaska to can salmon, that caused a glut on the market, which resulted in lower prices. So what did these corporate entities do? Well, they merged. Right at the turn of the century, the response to unrestrained catching of salmon was hinged upon the desire for both maximum cannery packs and the elimination of rival businesses. So companies in the last decade of the 19th century unified control of production and marketing. The Alaska Packing Association was the outgrowth of this early movement. It formed in 1892 from San Francisco, and it incorporated into the Alaska Packers Association in 1893. Now, essentially, this was a profit-sharing organization conducted by the Gilded Age industrial giants, right? They were just following a pattern. APA started out by buying 31 canneries and allowed only 9 to operate after 1893. Now, even on just this river alone, there are 3 canneries operating, the NN Cannery, Diamond O, and Diamond N. And I'll talk more about APA tomorrow night. But by 1900, APA controlled 70% of the industry, and I mean, they had a genuine monopoly. It stabilized the total pack of 2 million cases was produced annually, and they were taking out $10 million. Anybody tell me how much we purchased Alaska from Russia? Oh, come on, guys. We just had our 150 sesquicentennial. Say that 5 times. Oh, I don't even have any prizes. $7.2 million, right? I was just stalling so I could drink a glass of water. So, but yeah, $7.2 million. And these guys took out 10 million in there. So, yeah, so not a bad deal, right? So the San Francisco-based corporation literally became the backbone of Alaska's economy. And not to mention it's Achilles' heel. So the canned salmon industry consolidates Alaska, and the federal government's response was a little different than it was during the Gilded Age. It reflected a concern about this unfettered resource extraction, but also changes, right? The federal government was thinking about new approaches to natural resource management. And this is another reason why this is kind of important in these big schemes, because the federal government is changing its role, right? It's changing its role towards private industry. In previous centuries, the federal government had essentially left Western industries alone, right? Confident that laissez-faire capitalism would ensure rational growth, right? They thought that that hidden hand tool idea of liberalism would kind of balance everything out. Did it work? Not so much. It was generally believed that the frontier's infinite abundance of natural resources would provide for the expanding nation. But, of course, by the 1890s, the nation had consumed a large percentage of the frontier's natural wealth as the growing industrial society extracted resources at a rate far beyond the predictions of a pre-industrial, the pre-industrial policymakers. So in the face of species extinction and depleted environments, the government's new philosophy, this progressive philosophy towards resource management, embraced a conservation ethic that encouraged sustaining resources for practical purposes, right? So this required the government to gain a much greater knowledge of the resource's biological condition, hence the government scientists. Government officials then began to worry that by the turn of the century, that the use of traps in Alaska's Bristol Bay fishery would overharvest the resource to a point of complete destruction. They didn't want to see what happened in the West happen here in Alaska. So despite federal concerns, Bristol Bay commercial sockeye salmon grew at unsurpassed rates, right? They had a lot of sockeye salmon. There really was no fishing regulations to speak of. And there was this growing national market that existed for the product, just at the time the commercial markets were opening up by the turn of the century. And by this time, Americans are consuming canned salmon for its affordability as well as its health benefits. Why? Well, because Teddy Roosevelt read The Jungle, and the meatpacking industry was not exactly high on people's list, and the fish packers were able to jump on that and market their salmon as a much healthier product than eating meat. So in order to curb this type of unregulated, exploitive industrial practices consuming the great the great industries of America, they wanted to avoid that, right, in the Pacific Coast in Alaska. So the federal government gave the United States Fish Commission more authority. And the Fish Commission was established way back under President Grant, but under Teddy Roosevelt, things changed. It was renamed the Bureau of Fisheries. It was placed in the newly established Department of Commerce and Labor in 1903. And then a year later, in 1904, Roosevelt, who had become a strong advocate for conservation policy, directed the Bureau of Fish to make a thorough investigation of salmon fisheries for Alaska for the purpose of determining the extent, the causes of decline, if any, and the effects of regulation and the extent to which the laws are violated, right? He didn't want to mess around here. Remember, he was the one who went to go try to hunt a buffalo and couldn't find one. So this guy was not going to let this happen to the fish. So again, a little context here, right? Roosevelt's interest in Alaska salmon fisheries coincides with a sense of crisis among America's governing elite, concerned about the nation's dwindling natural resources. So according to the president himself, those natural resources were in danger of exhaustion if we permit the old wasteful methods of exploiting them to continue. So, of course, Teddy, his supporters for strong conservation measures represented a movement that rejected unregulated laissez-faire development and increasingly turned towards federal stewardship of natural resources. And it was in this climate of public-spirited conservationism that Roosevelt and other progressives began to call on the federal government to protect what was called the public's interest, right? That's what the government should do. That's what these progressives decided, to protect the public interest against what they saw as the greedy nature of the private interests, and to regulate and rationalize extractive economies in the name of national efficiency. So we save it for the greater good of the whole. They believe that unrestricted individualism in the quest for temporary and immediate profit should yield to government-regulated wise use. And by preserving natural resources on the basis of rational management and scientific expertise, federal scientists and politicians hope to stabilize industries, ensure economic growth, and to protect long-term sustainability for natural resources. So here in Bristol Bay, they started to apply early activities in Bristol Bay, and by beginning in the 1920s, these progressives. And this is where you have to kind of be careful with history. And what I'm going to tell you will probably shock you, because the kind of activities that they're doing in 1920, we would not do today. We know better, but they didn't know better then. And so that's kind of the job of history, is not necessarily to judge, but to understand and explain what was driving these guys. They were trying to save this, and unfortunately their activities are probably going to shock and appall you. But again, understanding it within context is very, very important. It's also important to understand the early conservationist efforts because the salmon runs in Bristol Bay are declining at a perilous rate by 1919. So the question is, what's happening? Another devastating event that's taking place in 1919, just as the Bristol Bay fishery is collapsing, is absolutely disastrous to Native people. The worst human calamity of the 20th century, which, by the way, we are in the 100th anniversary of, the Spanish flu pandemic that touched everyone from Gandhi to Woodrow Wilson, and to 200 people just who were descendants of this place right here, right? 200 people die in a week. Alaska will be impacted by the Spanish flu more than any other people in the world, right? Per capita, more people die in Alaska. The Spanish flu hit Bristol Bay and the Naknek River in the spring of 1919. It killed the parents. This was a devastating disease. It killed people my age and left people like my son here orphaned. Cannery doctors provided the only health care available for the survivors and the children. They were sent to a hospital at Kanakanak, and in fact, the indigenous population of Dillingham pretty much traced their roots to this 20th century pandemic. Although the flu outbreak and the decline of salmon in 1919 were unrelated, they do share a common cause. What is it? He's heard it before. Yes. World War I, yes. So years of overfishing by the industry, which was sanctioned by the government to feed troops in the trenches of France, caused fish runs to bottom out by the end of the war. So national security trumped conservation policy. In other words, limiting fish catch was not an option in those days. By 1920, then, the Bureau of Fisheries received marching orders to enhance the salmon runs for the commercial harvest, and they started to implement some kind of goofy ideas, right? The Bureau organized programs that set out to destroy what they called the natural enemies of the commercially coveted fishes in certain waters of the Bristol Bay District, including those predators important for local subsistence and personal use consumption. So they're taking out the resources that people depended on, and they get hit with a pandemic. So this was a pretty brutal time. So then on the Naknek River. Now remember, how many of you guys fished out here today? Anybody fish? Well, most of these guys who are paying what $7,000-8,000 a week to go fishing, they're going after these guys, right? So these bureau agents were trolling for steelhead and pike and grayling and lake trout, noting that it is safe to say that this species of lake trout is detrimental to the salmon industry, as is the Dolly Varden, if not more. So these guys were all targeted at Kittavik Creek, which is here, the modern day Brooks River. Burrow agents set up a camp from which they seined for lake trout and Dolly Varden, and he killed, I'm not kidding, over 16,000 pounds of fish in 1 year. So besides killing fish, they preyed on salmon and smolt and fry. Bureau agents modified the Brooks River area riverscape. In fact, the aim, again, aiding these adult salmon migrating between the Naknek and Brooks lakes. The Bureau's objective was to remove the obstructions in the stream, especially at the falls, right? So you guys go out there and in awe, but the falls and the fish jumping it, and they went out there and they saw this is an obstruction. They wanted to give these fish an easier passage upriver. So at again Kittavik Creek, which was the name that they used in the 1920s, it wasn't changed until Griggs changed it in 21. The bureau agents they loved it because they thought it was an ideal stream with fine spawning bottoms, but it had this bad little problem in the way, a waterfall, right? So what do you think they did? Well, they're going to help the fish, right? So they determined that the Brooks Falls was an obstruction. So that's what they labeled it. So bureau agents, they used steel bars and stone cutting gads and hammers and picks, and they cut a 10-foot gap right in the bedrock with the idea of trying to divert stream around so the fish had an easier passage. And in their report, they soundly declared that the fish can now pass without difficulty. This statement, of course, was made without recognizing salmon have been leaping these falls pretty successfully since the glaciers retreated and the waters went down. And according to one agent, removing the so-called obstruction was necessary due to the injuries caused by the migrating salmon. So they didn't understand that the salmon died because they, spawn till you die, that thing. So, right? So they just thought that they were trying to save them. So again, it helps give us a little context on what's happening. The other thing they were doing, again, kind of makes our stomach hurt a little, was predatory control. They went after the trout and the other fish species well into the 20s, 1921, they were doing it. And now they're going after the predatory birds. So nice little mama merganser with all her cute little babies. If you saw them out there, well, they would have gone after those guys. In 1922, agents made several trips to islands in Naknek Lake for the purpose of destroying the Arctic tern eggs. And they even paid bounties for eagle claws. The Bureau efforts to kill predators continued throughout the 1920s, and by the end of the decade, trout had a 5-cent bounty on its head. Not surprising, the operation showed effective results, in their words. As one agent reported, trout are becoming more difficult to capture each year. And by 24, one guy at Kittavik Camp noted that trout appear very scarce at every point in comparison with previous years, and the native people reported extremely poor catches last winter, and they're, saying this is a good thing. So here's the thing. Despite efforts of enhanced salmon runs, the runs continued to decline. So what we're realizing is a lot is happening in the ocean, right? These natural fluctuations, but of course they didn't know any of this. Back in 1914, the federal government established fisheries reserves in an attempt to direct control over territorial fisheries. That really doesn't go over well with Alaskans at all. But that's a whole other story. The response is that the government is going to encourage artificial propagation of hatcheries. So what they're doing is they're saying, hey, we're a bunch of scientists, we're smart people, we're progressives, we believe in the future, let's just make our own salmon. So the methods were appealing for a couple reasons. First of all, well, you can have technology, and that convinced the canners and the governments to say, well, we don't really have to tell people not to fish too much. We can just have science solve that for us. And the second, again, it played right into the progressives' belief that humans could apply technology and scientific solutions to very complex ecological problems. But does it work? No, it doesn't work. On June 6, 1924, the Bureau rationalized efforts. It's actually codified by Congress with the White Act. The White Act dramatically expanded the powers of the Secretary of Commerce to limit and prohibit fisheries in Alaska, and it extended the policy power of fisheries agents. But it's still, through all this legislation, as they're patting themselves on the back, saying, yep, they didn't do anything to actually save the fish. 5 years in, and the sockeye populations are still plummeting. They have not recovered from wartime overcapitalization and overfishing. So recognizing the dilemma, Bureau managers begin to advocate for more effective rational government policies guided by rigors of science. This meant shaping fisheries law according to science and the doctrine of maximum sustainable yield. And that's what you guys were witnessing out there today. If fisheries managers could regulate harvests, so the amount of salmon, you could catch as surplus, right? You just let the escapement go up to spawn. If they could figure out how much that is, if they could calculate it, then they would know how many fish they could let, the fishers catch. All they had to do was math, right? And count. Although science supported the maximum sustainable yield data, this is very imperfect in the 1920s, right? Agencies, they installed counting stations along the Naknek River. They started counting at weir stations. And, of course, those poor fish that show up late, they're the ones that get caught. So it's probably a good idea to be the first. So that same year, the Bureau of Fisheries biologists, they begin counting fish on the Naknek River. Just that same year, the stock market crashes, spirals into the Great Depression, thereby renewing market demand for what? Canned salmon. It's cheap and it's a good protein. So this high protein, relative affordability made canned salmon again an attractive staple for many depression-struck diets. 1930s also brings national security attention to Bristol Bay. Relations between Washington and Tokyo worsen. The Bureau of Fisheries become ensnared in an international affair taking place just off the Alaska coast. 1937, Japanese ship, several of them are observed fishing for sockeye just 20 miles west of the mouth of the Ugashik and the Naknek Rivers in Bristol Bay. Not only were the Japanese fishing in the bay, but they were using gill nets nearly 9 times the legal length, 200 fathoms long. Although the Japanese government claimed that the boats were fishing for crab, the United States was otherwise convinced and felt that the fleet threatened the salmon fishing industry. This is a very obscure little story, but it actually explains everything that was going on out here. They sent the scientists here to solve the, so this was the very first camp out here at Brooks Lake, or right at the mouth of Brooks Lake at the end of the opening of the river, and that's what they were sending these guys out to do, and no one knew that because this was all kind of hush-hush national security matters. So national concerns over the Japanese offshore fishing in Bristol Bay prompts Congress to direct new series of studies of salmon fisheries in Bristol Bay determined to impact the Japanese and domestic fishing in Bristol Bay sockeye salmon population. So this was, of course, a potential country we're going to go to war with. And they were concerned about that, but they were also very worried that they were right there off the shore. So that's in many ways what they were doing. It wasn't just for the commercial fishery, it was also for national security purposes too. So a guy named George B. Calez, which is the mountains named after, was the first director of the Bristol Bay Salmon Research Group. Fellow biologist Thomas Barnaby, they made preliminary reconnaissance surveys in 1938. And that year, Bureau of Fish, U.S. Fish and Biological Survey, and the Department of Agriculture are moved to the Department of Interior. And in 1940, they combined to create a new agency, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Congress charged this newly created Fish and Wildlife Service the task of implementing the Bristol Bay investigation in 1939. And that investigation was both for the enhancement of the commercial fishery, but also the national security stuff that no one knew about. So beginning in 1940, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they focused on Bristol Bay investigation right here on this 1.5 mile long Brooks River located in the Naknek drainage because of its central location. It's small but rich sockeye run. Their biologists would conduct sockeye salmon eggs, smolt survival studies. They're using data that will help manage the entire Bristol Bay fishery. So the priority was to freight material to from Brooks Naknek to Brooks Lake. As Hiker later put it, this was back-breaking work. The goal was the first year was to build the weir. Biologists' greatest effort, according to them, was starting the construction of the laboratory headquartered up at Brooks Lake. Has anybody been up to Brooks Lake to see this? You can actually walk up there and check out these properties. This is actually the most impressive of all the architecture out here. This is the most impressive one. The crew, in fact, some of the crew included local people. Robert Hill, for example, they had a clee track and they basically drove from Naknek all the way out here to Brooks Lake. Now, they also hauled supplies, the Muskeg-bound trail, and they started counting fish. They also started making groundwork for the lab. Here's your some of the pictures from their foundation. So by 1941, Bureau biologists, remember, are the only federal presence out here. Even though this is Katmai National Monument, there's no National Park Service people here. So when the Bureau of Fisheries first requested permission from the National Park Service to build this field station, the Park Service, there wasn't anybody here to ask. But there were people here, right? It wasn't like this was an empty space. There were native people here. There were people from Naknek trapping here, and Peterson is getting ready to be here, right? And so what the Fish and Wildlife Service biologist guy said, hey, look, we can help you, Park Service. Since you guys don't have a presence here, we can kind of keep an eye on things, especially as the military, right? It's World War II. Military base was pretty active, and they had, especially between Naknek and Kodiak, they would send guys out here and they would just go crazy fishing. And Fish and Wildlife said, hey, we can help you kind of manage this place, keep an eye on things if you let us build our lab. And the acting director at the time, Hillary Tolson, concurred, expecting the Bureau's footprint to be rather minimal. Now, because MPS had very little presence in the monument, they recognized that this wasn't such a bad deal for them. So they kind of worked together, one sister agency helping out the other. Fisheries investigation continued throughout the war years, and by 43, they had completed the lab. In spite of reduced staff, essentially because of the war effort, they did manage to build a water tower. And again, and this is all kind of, I'm telling you this is because these are all properties that I'm nominating to the National Register. So together they tell a more complete story. So biologists expand their fish counting, the research efforts, and they're actually engaging in new technologies. See that airplane up there? They're tagging, but they're using aerial technology to count fish too. So they take photographs of the fish and then they create an index. So these are tools that they're developing out here. And because of its small size, biologists, again, are choosing some of the tributary streams around Brooks Lake to also help do experiments in tagging. The same season, Fish and Wildlife recommences activities focused on the so-called natural obstacles. Yep, they go back to that story. And they decide that the old fish passage that they constructed in 1920 isn't going to work. So 4 biologists are detailed in 1949 to construct a fish ladder, a concrete fish ladder in the Brooks Falls. Did anybody see it out there? Well, if you go out to the falls, you can kind of look around the corner and you'll see the concrete ledge. And so back in 1939, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service did have preliminary discussions with the Park Service in San Francisco about the latter. In 1940, NPS biologist Victor Kalani and McKinley superintendent Frank Bean, which was kind of the park overseeing the monument here, accompanied U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to Brooks Falls, where the men saw the location of the intended ladder. And then in 49, MPS's regional landscape architect even visited the area. They kind of looked to make sure that the site would be appropriate for MPS's idea of natural landscapes to help it out. But here's the thing. And he was like, well, we never said you could actually do it, even though they helped build, basically. So, but even though they weren't so happy with this is 1947, and there's no NPS presence. I mean, so we're talking about almost a half a century in. And Alaskans are just trying to become a state. Tourism is becoming a big issue, which is why Peterson starts this place. And they're like, what are you guys doing? Either get rid of this monument or, leave. And so Katmai in 1947, with pressure from the territorial Alaskans, along with, crying for the about especially trapping and hunting issues, they really didn't make this ladder an issue. They thought this is not the time to do that. However, ideological political disagreement aside, the ladder proved pretty problematic because the fish never used it, right? They don't know why, but they probably, the fish actually begin to run, the runs begin to continue to decline by 1950. And in the 1950s, the Alaska runs are declared a disaster. Meanwhile, this guy right here, pilot and entrepreneur Ray Peterson, had established Angler's Paradise Lodge in Brooks Camp for sports fishermen. This meant that more and more anglers now were coming to the Brooks River. And U.S. Fish and Wildlife biologists continued to study the area's salmon now for more commercial use. That's Adlai Stevens, by the way, and Bartlett, the senator, future senator of Alaska. So Peterson had some friends in high places, right? So in 1951, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decided to shrink Brooks Camp's crew in 51. Nevertheless, they completed some pretty impressive things. The stone fireplace and chimney, it was pretty cool. They completed that. In 1952, biologists replaced the temporary weir with a permanent one. And also in 1952, biologists had a special guest. Dwight D. Eisenhower came by after saving the free world. He and his buddies, General Alfred Gunther and Commandant of the Army War College, and General Craig, the commander of the Alaska Theater, came by to do a little fishing. According to the head biologist, the men spent the better part of the day fishing, relaxing, and inspecting the research operation. I'd say that's a well-deserved R&R, right? So sweeping changes occur once again with congressional passage of the Fish and Wildlife Act in 1956. The act created two new bureaus, the Bureau of Commercial Fisheries, the Bureau of Sports Fisheries, and the Bristol Bay Investigation, the BBI, was transferred into the Bureau of Commercial Fisheries. The new division also brought changes in guard. Those who had participated in the previous 10 years left the scene, and according to Eicher, the head biologist, a new era had begun. So the original purpose of the Bristol Bay investigation, again, had been secret for a long time. The studies were primarily used to provide data for the North Pacific Fisheries Treaty signed by Canada, Japan, and the United States in 1953. Now, once this objective was achieved, Bristol Bay Investigation and the Brooks Lake shifted its chief focus from international high seas fishing to one more aimed to determine the physical, the chemical, the biological factors affecting the abundance and survival of the red salmon in fresh water. So in other words, they're getting back to the basics. They're trying to understand these fish and this more complete, holistic idea now that we're starting to understand ecosystems and how they work. And in 1957, they got the last wing of the lab done. and the research still focused on management as well as enhancement of the commercial fisheries. So underpinning the red salmon studies at Brooks Lake was the previous generation's call for rational, scientifically managed commercial fishery for its maximum sustainable yield. And aspiring to better understand Bristol Bay spawning behavior, the investigations found female sockeye in Brooks Lake were more fertile than those in other rivers, which is pretty interesting. The biologists discovered that the so-called predatory bears, they only consume spawned fish. So this whole idea of natural predation had very little effect on the overall fish production. So they learned, right? They learned and they changed policy because of that. And in addition, the biologists conducted studies that focused on the migratory behavior of salmon young. And in the end, they showed that salmon develop very specific migratory behaviors that increase their ability to avoid predators, which is pretty cool. So these fish out here swim together in big schools, and as they know, those bears are going to try to eat them, and not to mention others too. So they try to gather in schools to confuse the predators, so they bulk up. Ultimately, these studies enabled scientists to conclude that natural predators were far less a threat to salmon than the biggest predator of all, us, right? And again, learning from previous mistakes. So despite agency disagreement over the fish ladder in the falls by the early 1960s, the relationship between the fisheries biologists at Brooks Lake and NPS employees was very positive and friendly, collaborative, and it produced some pretty important discoveries. For example, this is an age of what you might even call creative science. Interdisciplinary ideas were coming into the fore, and Bureau biologists had known for decades that people had depended on the Brooks River salmon for a very long time. Now, to gain a better understanding of this prehistoric relationship, the ancient salmon runs of Brooks Lake, the Bureau supervisor, his name was Ted Merrill, and he sponsored an archaeological team from the University of Oregon. And that initiated the first archaeological investigation of the Brooks River's cultural past. And what did this do? It produced one of the greatest archaeological finds in Alaska. The Bureau, they recruited this graduate student, Don, there on the edge. The elder hostels call him the Elvis of archaeology, by the way. He's quite the guy. Well, Don Dumond, he became the field supervisor for Brooks Camp. And by the way, almost all my information about the geology here, cultural history, comes from that guy, right? It's all him. And over the course of the next 5 years, they actually weren't able to find out the history of the salmon because the organic material wasn't able to, it didn't survive, but they were able to uncover an extensive archaeological complex on both sides of the Brooks River. And Dumond and his associates from Oregon, they continued to investigate throughout the 1970s, discovering something upward to 700, 800, almost 1,000 different house sites just here in this 1 mile area. The archaeological resources of the Brooks River were recognized as the Brooks River Archaeological District. It was listed on the National Register in 1978, and it is now designated a National Historic Landmark. So it is your history. This is important at a national level. It's pretty cool. Even the reason why the platform rises up is certainly to get you guys kind of safer away from the bears, but it's also to get you off all of those house sites you're walking over, right? So everywhere you see out here is a cultural site. So it is sacred ground. Between 1958 and 1961, the BCF research had expanded to cover the entire neck drainage. The red salmon survival research was conducted now year-round, and it was very important for Ted to get the best and the brightest. So interestingly enough, to get the best and the brightest to stay, he needed to create housing for families, right? So he's the one who started the panaboat thing. That's why you see it everywhere, right? He's the one who came up with the idea, and everybody else did it to keep it uniform. And in fact, I love this picture. He turned 2 in this picture. He's at one of the houses up at Brooks Lake. His Wilbur H. Hartman. It was his family. They lived in the first cottage, and they had a little chain link fence around the play area to deter the curious bear. And in those days, there just weren't a lot of bears around here. So, so the field's best and brightest worked at Brooks, and that seemed to bode well for the salmon management. By 1963, scientific research allowed the biologists to understand more and more about the lives of sockeye salmon and the natural population fluctuations. The findings were significant because they show the environmental factors, the influence salmon runs, and that the harvest had to be closely monitored and adjusted to circumstances of each run. You just can't come up with a magic number, right? Every run is unique and complex. And by 1967, fisheries research at Brooks Lake began to slow down because Brooks wasn't, in fact, the best place to understand this. This is actually kind of a unique situation here. This isn't a typical river system. So in 1970, Brooks, the biologists transferred all of the property, the BCF, the Bureau of Commercial Fish, was transferred to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, in the Commerce Department, and renamed NIMS. NIMS conducted nominal research in the Naknek drainage for a few years, but then funding started to dry up for the Brooks activities, and by 1974, they transferred all of their properties to the National Park Service, and thus Brooks Lake's role in management of the nation's most prolific sockeye fishery came to an end. But in 1978, they gained a few of these properties, such as the lab, and these little outhouses that supported this work. Again, they're not exactly like you'd be like, wow, that's some architectural wonder, but it tells a story. That's why these properties matter. And this guy right here is the only fish ladder in a national park that will be listed on the National Register. And again, it's not because it worked and why it's important, it's because it failed. And these are stories we should remember. We shouldn't just erase it and pretend that it didn't happen because we want a natural scene. We need to remember these things so we can learn from them, right? So when rangers are on the platform, and God forbid there's no bears out there, and people are like, where are the bears? And you can talking about this and tell this story, because this is a history that matters, because in the history of things that work, there's a time that they didn't, right? So it's that story that we need to know too. So the buildings, they were constructed to hold, people who worked here and did this work. And, those same people for the Park Service did the same thing. I actually lived in BL3 when I was a ranger out here. And probably the most important thing is that the Bristol Bay Fisheries investigation, right, in fisheries science, it prompted the archaeological investigation by Don Dumond, which resulted in one of the greatest discoveries of the largest archaeological site in Alaska. This is huge. This is why it matters. So most significantly, the buildings of Brooks Lake collectively represent the most intact properties in Alaska that represent the history of fisheries science and management. And under the auspices of the BBI, it furthered the scientific understanding of sockeye salmon, which helped to develop the foundation for the modern day management of one of the most successful fisheries in the world. So the combination of sound science resulting in rational management has made Bristol Bay fishery the most prolific and hopefully for the time being a sustainable fishery, and the most important in the United States, certainly, and has since become a model for fisheries management worldwide. And in an age where we don't have a lot of good stories to share, this is a fish story that is rarely told, but one that is certainly worth remembering. So thank you all very much. I hope you enjoy the rest of your stay. If you have questions, I'll be happy to answer. But otherwise, if you want to get out and enjoy the rest of that sunshine, I will not be insulted. So thank you so much.